Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and hello everyone also from my side. As announced, I'm talking today about the Geocoded German Longitudinal Election Study, or in short GLES, and we'll show you some empirical applied examples how to use this, but also specifically set the focus on what kind of data are we actually talking about, why do we actually offer at GLES geocoded survey data, what's interesting about it, and also how are they created and curated here at GLES. Yeah, we'll start a little bit. Why are we actually using or needing geocoded survey data? And place-based explanations, also electoral geography, has a very long tradition and history actually in the social science research and the field of social sciences. I brought a little bit of a map and picture of a very early work of Andreas Siegfried from 1913 actually, who was basically the founder of electoral geography, and he looked at France in the 20th or also in the 19th century and looked at soil composition in specific areas and how this could explain political preferences in France. So this is very, very early work in this group of explanation and place-based explanations in the social sciences. There are several mechanisms at work when we talk about this kind of place-based explanations. And one of the first ones is always the notion that interactions and events occur in place. So they are literally taking place. And this is also something we find in a lot of social science theories. We can think about Alpert's contact theory, for example. That actually, when you're on the streets, you meet people, you encounter people, you might encounter foreigners, might this affect your attitudes and so on. So this is a very basic notion of what we are talking about here. There's also the idea of identities and social capital and also culture being tied into specific places and have kind of a historic legacy of specific places, for example, voting a specific way, but also having, for example, xenophobic attitudes and so on. So this is also kind of an explanatory mechanism which can be at work and we can still find today. Last one, or the third one, I also concentrate a little bit on today, is the idea and the notion that local context conditions can actually serve as heuristics for evaluations and decision making. What does it mean? Again, I actually perceive how my environment is split up, how the economic situation is in my neighborhood, how accessible are public services, and then I evaluate, for example, the government about it and say, okay, if I can't access the services, actually nobody is caring about me and about my neighborhood. And this can then affect, again, voting behavior, but also political trust and political alienation, basically. When I say this has a long tradition, and we find a lot of also from the 60s, 70s, and 80s approaches of electoral geography and also geographic explanations in the social science in general, many of those approaches usually relied on aggregate level data. What are aggregate level data? We basically talk here about data on, for example, the district level, the municipality level, that says us about electoral behavior, but also the composition of a district or municipality, the rate of unemployed in this area, for example. And while this data brings us a lot of new evidence and a lot of interesting insights, we still have a lot of challenges or problems when it comes to this data. And one of those is the ecological fallacy you might have heard about before. So the idea that when I find a correlation on an aggregate level, can I actually infer from this level on an individual level? And can I find or can I say that correlation I found here is actually also proven right on a smaller or an individual level? And we can minimize this risk of ecological fallacy with aggregate level data when we come to a smaller spatial scale. So if we minimize the spatial scale we're analyzing, but still it can be at play. Another problem is that research questions are, of course, limited to the data available on this level I'm investigating. So maybe for voting behavior, we actually have the information on an aggregate level on municipalities, on districts, on electoral districts, but we don't have this information when it comes to attitudes, for example. So to answer those questions and actually investigate political attitudes in the individual and the effects of the context and the neighborhood on those individuals, we need this geocoded survey data. What are geocoded survey data? Basically, survey data with direct and indirect spatial references. Direct spatial reference would be a point coordinate. So actually, geospatial information I can map into space. And an indirect spatial reference would be an address. So it's basically just the direct spatial reference, always the thing that's actually already mapped into space, into a coordinate reference system, where I can actually identify it. Sometimes those geocoded survey data, they are already enhanced with spatial data attributes. So we sometimes already have linked data that already contain some information about a specific context. And as I already said and introduced, the general goal of this data and working with this data is to analyze interactions between individual behavior and attitudes and the environment they are living in. But I also want to start or note from the beginning is that the data access to this kind of data is usually restricted, and this is due to data protection regulations. When I already talk about addresses and point coordinates, I think it's pretty clear that we always have a problem of re-identification of the individuals when we're working with those data. And so we always work in a very secure environment if we're working with this data, and also the data access is regulated, and we don't just publish this data on, for example, the GLES website. We have a couple of survey programs at GLES who all offer or will offer geocoded survey data, besides the GLES, the ALBOS, but also the GLES panel, and in the future also FREDA have this information, and you can work with this information. However, today I will focus on the German longitudinal election study because, as introduced, I'm a data curator, not only for some of the surveys there, but also for specifically this regional data of the GLES. Short notion about the German longitudinal election study. The German longitudinal election study is the main survey program in Germany to analyze or to collect data on political attitudes and specifically voting behavior. We work in close cooperation with the DGFW, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Wahlforschung, so the German Association for Electoral Research. And we have a couple of surveys that are rolled out during the election years, but also in between election years. And you see here the several surveys, and they are all collected in different modes. So we have our cross-section that is both surveyed CABI and PAPI, so online and paper and pencil. Our rolling cross-section study with daily samples before the federal election, which is based on a telephone survey. And then we have our online surveys, the panel and the tracking, which are also running in between election years. And in the last row, you find the nomination study and the candidate study. I won't talk about this a lot because those are not studies that concentrate on the electorate, but they rather concentrate on the candidates and collect data on them. What we are interested in is basically the respondent's location and how we survey the respondent's location or how we collect this information. And collecting this information is determined by basically two aspects. The first one, the sampling method, and the second one, the mode where we collect the data. So you already see for our cross-section, this survey is based on a register sample, and with the register sample, we actually collect the address data of our respondents. And we can base everything, or we can use this as the smallest location to identify the place where the respondent lives. It's a little bit different when it comes to the rolling cross-section and also panel and tracking data. Here we actually collect the zip codes, so the postal codes of the respondents. For the rolling cross-section, you find the zip code municipality. That's because we have actually a telephone survey, and when we collect the zip code and we find out the zip code doesn't exist, or we can't directly map the zip code to an electoral district, we actually ask persons then to also name the place they're actually living, the municipality, to clarify their location. We, of course, can't do this for our CABI data, for our online surveys. So there we only rely on self-reported zip codes. Most of you might already wonder about this, but of course, we have specific sources and uncertainties, sources of uncertainties, and also errors when it comes to collecting this data, especially when it comes to those self-reported data points. So, of course, with the self-reporting, we always have the problem that, especially in our online surveys, they're just zip codes that are not existent. So we can't control if the respondent is actually giving us the real location, the real zip code and postal code. And we find that around 1 to 1.5% of the zip codes we collect over the time, they are just not existent. And if they are existent, of course, they have no real control mechanism if this is the real zip code the respondent living in. So you can just choose a random zip code or maybe from an old location you were living and give us the zip code, and we can't have control over this kind of bias in our surveys. This is specifically problematic considering that there are some studies that there are reporting differences between gender, education level that appear when collecting the self-reported zip codes. What we do, and which can be an alternative, is that we include some questions on the characteristics of the living place, so about the housing, about the level of urbanization, and they can be quite good indicators to actually measure some characteristics of the respondent's neighborhood. However, we can't use this information for linking. Second source for errors or uncertainty is the problem of matching administrative units in Germany. Everyone who has ever worked with different sources of context information and geocoded surveys has the problem that the administrative units are not like just one-to-one linking, basically. So you can see this here. Municipalities have another shape than zip codes have another shape than constituencies, for example. And there's no direct match possible in some circumstances, especially when it comes, for example, to bigger cities. They usually, you can see this North Rhine-Westphalia. You can easily identify on the municipality map, actually, the big cities like Cologne and Bonn and Düsseldorf. And you can see, of course, they have many zip codes, but just one municipality. And then again, you have several electoral districts in these bigger cities, but they, again, don't match with the zip codes. So there's a huge source of error if you can't really control this kinds of different units. And lastly, another source of uncertainty and error is the problem of relocations and changes over time. This can happen on the one hand on the side of the survey respondent. So respondents might move between the point we did the sampling and the survey, or also in our panel, for example, between survey waves. But we also have the problem of redistricting in Germany. So there are a lot of like municipality reforms or district reforms where we actually define new districts, and sometimes it's quite a change. So you can see these two maps from Sachsen-Anhalt, where we have a lot of districts actually coming in together, and redistricting is a huge problem when you want to, for example, run analysis over a long time period and you only have one time point where you collected the information where a respondent lives. So these are all sources of uncertainty and errors, and some or most of them are actually not such a big problem when you rely on address data and on the register sample. And this is the reason why we actually always prefer to work with this kind of data. Obviously, we don't have any self-report bias. Secondly, we can work on a very small spatial scale. So we don't rely on zip codes or municipalities, but we actually know where the respondent actually lives. And the good thing is that once geocoded, we have the complete toolbox of spatial linking methods available to actually get all the information on regional units and districts and municipalities that we need and want to add here. There's actually this nice picture you can see popping up in all of our presentations on this topic, that when you know where the respondent lives, you can actually add the district boundaries, but you can also add information about the grid cell he's living in. So you can do this one-to-one linking to different administrative units and also across time. So you don't have the problem then again, if you have a redistricting, you can actually just add this kind of shape, this shapefile, so this level again, and you can find out, okay, in 2015, this person lived here, and this would be the district XY in 2007. Another benefit of working with those kind of data is that you can define your own spatial zones. So filter techniques, buffer zones, neighboring units, this is all possible. For example, buffer zone would be that I have a respondent's location, a geocoordinate, and then I can say, okay, I define the neighborhood as the 50-kilometer radius around this person's place where he or she lives. And then I can actually collect data on this kind of level. And lastly, you can also work with distance measures now. That means you can really measure the distance to the next train station, the next hospital, and you can create your own measurements based on this location of the respondent. Of course, remaining challenge here is that you actually need this other geospatial information you want to link. So I actually need the information about the different or several district boundaries. I actually need the information of where is the next hospital. So this is all information that you still need to do that, but it's increasingly becoming available, those information also for the public and also for different federal institutions. Because of that, and because we like those address data, and it's a good idea to work with them, and this is also the information we use for those sensitive regional data sets we offer at GLES. I will basically concentrate here on the cross-section and on our register sample. This data is actually, I will talk about now, is actually already published at the end of last year. So you can find it online. When I say you can find it online, you can't find the data online, but you can find our variable report online, where you get a little bit more information about the creation of this data set, what it contains, and also about the access and how to access this data. So the sensitive regional data, we basically use R for everything when we create this data set. R and R Studio has evolved into a full-blown GIS tool basically by now. So we can do everything we want to do in R, which makes our life a little bit more easy than introducing also new software. So when I'm talking about this and about the steps to create this data set, it's all R-based. How we create this data set. So the first step is the data pre-processing. And one of the most important first steps here is that we again have to apply to data regulation and data sensitivity. So we actually split our data sets in three main data sets. The survey data with the attributes we collected in the survey. We have the address data, and then we have another correspondence table and data set that can match survey and address data. And all of those three data sets are stored in separate locations and in secure and encoded places. Why are we doing this? We never want that our survey data are actually directly matchable, so to say, with the address data at hand. And this is all for data security. Another first step here is the cleaning of the address data. We get, as I said, our register sample, and all of the municipalities provide different information. So for example, when you get addresses from Berlin, you usually get information of which floor the person lives, in a back house or the second or the third back house. So that's all information we don't need and we don't want. And we clean those addresses before we can actually geocode them. The geocoding process, basically geocoding is just the conversion of indirect spatial references, addresses, into then the direct spatial references, the geocoordinates. And there are several providers with which you can do this geocoding process. But again, data protection issues are at play here, and also quality concerns, because often you don't have a transparent process. But if you just think about, basically, you can type an address in Google Maps and you will get a geocoordinate. However, we are working with a tool or data by the Federal Agency of Cartography and Geodesy in Germany. They're actually providing an online interface and an API for online geocoding, but they also make it possible to do offline geocoding by providing the raw address data with linked geocoordinates. Those data and services are restricted, but make it possible that actually we can do the geocoding offline in-house. And for this purpose, colleagues here at GLES developed R package, the BKG geocoder. for offline geocoding, and Stefan will actually talk about this tool in April here in this Meet the Experts series. So if you have interest in this and in details of this geocoding process with this tool, he's there and he will answer all your questions, but you can also access the information and all of the coding behind this tool online via GitHub. What do we retrieve from this geocoding? As I said, we turn the addresses in point coordinates, but we already create administrative unit keys and so-called Inspire IDs. Inspire IDs is basically an ID for a grid cell. And we have this Inspire grid cell. This is a grid net for all of Europe, where we have a harmonized and standardized location and size of grid cells. And this is very handy when you want to do comparative work across Europe, but also in Germany, you have, for example, the sensors who are actually providing data on this grid cell level, and you can work with it. So this is something we also have in our data sets. However, sometimes we want more information and they are not provided by the geocoding. And what we do then is the spatial joins. So we use the geocoordinates to actually then join, for example, information of the constituency the person lives in, but also if we want to, for example, have administrative units across time to one harmonized status, we can do this as well. For example, if the GLES has this 2015 harmonized territorial status, and I actually can add this information as well with a spatial join and know where this person lived in a specific time point. And of course, you could add to this. This is kind of an ambiguous choice, but you can actually add to this different administrative units and different geospatial information. After you added all the geospatial information, of course, we have some basic data wrangling tools we have to do. We have to do some missing coding, add additional variables, meta variables, and so on, and some data cleaning and cumulation. And in the end, and this is again very important, we actually delete the addresses and point coordinates. So we have a clean data set where we now have as the smallest unit our Inspire grid cells, basically. So we don't store addresses and point coordinates for a long time, but only for the time being when we create this data set. I also added this little table here to show or give you some information about how well our geocoding process works. So this is kind of what we do when we do also our data checks. So most of our addresses can actually be directly geocoded. It's about 69%. For some, we have to do some manual checks and corrections. This can happen, for example, when there have been some changes in names of addresses between the time our raw data and address data is from and the time our survey is from. And also we have sometimes some problems with hyphenated addresses and street names in Germany. So then we have to do some manual checks and corrections. And there are also some addresses we can't geocode. This might be, again, the problem of addresses that don't exist, addresses we can't find out why they're not geocoded and what the problem is, but also most of them, the problem is that we have addresses that have been deleted by request of the respondent. So respondent can actually tell us that they want their address deleted, and of course, those are not then in the geocoded data set. What does this data set look like? Here you see at least some variables you would find in there. You have an ID, of course. You have the different keys of municipalities, district, constituencies, one for the sampling year and then for the harmonized year. And as I said, the grid cell ID as well. And sometimes we also have some contextual level information. For example, here we have the municipality size. And now it comes to the linking process, and this is very straightforward. Of course, you can link the GLES survey data to this data set and get all the survey attributes, but you can, of course, also link the contextual data to this. So either you have an administrative unit key, for example, the municipality, and then the unemployment rate, for example, or on the Inspire ID level, the population size of a specific grid cell. You can link this directly via those ID variables. So this is the very straightforward, and I think the case what most of our users are also requesting, to actually bring some data they want to link with the survey data and then use. When I say how our users use the data, in the most common case, just a few words on data access. Because the data are so sensitive, they're only accessible on site at GLES via our safe room. And usually, as I said, you get the survey data linked with a requested identifier. We work here with the principle of data parsimony. That means you only get the identifier you really need for your linking and not just the whole data set. And researchers usually bring their own contextual level data and have the possibility then to link this geospatial information to our survey data, run the analysis, take the output with them, and then actually write up their paper or whatsoever and do their research with it. If you're interested in doing this, you always can consult the GLES team for the GLES data, but also the ALBOS and GESIS panel team for their data, and complete a data use agreement and then organize a visit here in Cologne. What I promised in the beginning is also to give a little bit of an applied example how to use this data. I'm lucky that I'm on site, so I can actually have access to this data, and I will show you or give you some insight and some ongoing work in progress from my side on the German federal election in 2021 as a quite interesting case where we see definitely some spatial polarization happening, but still many open questions on what drives the spatial polarization. I always like to show this share of votes by electoral district, because it's very intuitively showing that, for example, the Greens, you always nicely see the city centers and the cities to be the places where they gain the most votes, while the other way around, you have the AfD, where you have a lot of dark blue in the east of Germany, but also in some more rural places in the south of Germany. I will spare a little bit on the theoretical framework and don't talk a lot about theory, but spend the last minutes to show you some results. And therefore, just shortly, the research question investigated here right now is the question of if living in a left behind place actually affect voting for the AfD in the 2021 German federal election. Where does this research question come from? There's a lot of ongoing work on the so-called geography of discontent or left behind places in political science. And all of this work kind of combines the basic idea that people who live in a left behind place or in a deprived place where it's no access to public services, where the economic situation is relatively worse than other places, those people living there develop a feeling of lacking societal recognition. They feel left behind by the state or by globalization or by the society in total. And this fuels basically political resentment and makes these people more susceptible for radical right parties, and therefore they start to vote for radical right parties. In Germany, we have some evidence for spatial polarized voting behavior in 2021. There are already some paper and research notes out there who find at least some evidence that plays a role. But in the last years, we also had a lot of mixed findings for the relation of the AfD success and local economic disadvantages in Germany. Both quantitative and qualitative studies showed that there are some effects of like a rural-urban divide, but it's not only the rural places that actually vote for the AfD. It's also a lot of prosperous places, for example, in Bavaria and the south of Germany. And it's not just the easy story of there are economically disadvantaged rural places where everyone is voting for the AfD. Looking into this for the 2021 election in Germany, no surprise here, using the GLES 2021 cross-section and the Geocoded survey with the address data, and actually using some geospatial information to operationalize here the left behind places. So the basic question is, how does those left behind characteristics affect then the voting behavior. And I focus here on three characteristics, and that's the economic situation, the demographic composition, and the access to public services. Maybe the most interesting question here for this talk is, how do I actually measure those place-based measurements? And the first two actually use micron data, and those are provided on the 1 kilometer times 1 kilometer grid level by micron. So I actually can measure the economic situation as the share of households with an average income less than 60% of the German median income. This less than 60% of the German median income is usually used as this risk of poverty threshold. And then you take the share of this in a 1 kilometer times 1 kilometer grid. And the demographic composition is here the share of the over 60 years old also in this grid. Access to public services is a little bit more complicated in a sense, but there we can actually, or it's actually nice to use some data on the location of the actual public services. So I use here the general practicer, train stations, supermarket, post office, pharmacies. This luckily information that are made available once again by the BKG, but also, for example, the Deutsche Bahn is actually providing the coordinates of their train stations in Germany. And what I do here is I actually take the centroid of a grid cell and I calculate the distance to each of those locations of the public services and find out which is the closest one and take the mean of all of the closest distances to those public services. So you actually have a really nice accessibility measurement at hand with those data. Question, of course, now is how does it play out and what are the results? And the first variables, you can actually see the individual level variables and then the grid level. And what you see basically is our nice neighborhood effects are not there, or not in the way we would expect. So none of those neighborhood or context level variables actually reach a significant level. This is maybe counterintuitive, but this can have many reasons. And one of them is definitely that the voting for the AfD, we don't have so many voters in our AfD voters in our service. They are hard to reach. We have some self-selection biases. But also, when you think about the mechanism I presented, it's also maybe nice to go a step back and look at, are people actually frustrated? And this is the nice thing when we have now geocoded survey data, because we don't only have to concentrate on the actually voting behavior, so we can actually look at the attitudinal level. And what you see here is that actually the living in a grid cell or living in a neighborhood where the poverty risk is high, and if you have hard accessibility of the public services, your likelihood to perceive societary recognition or the lack of societary recognition is also higher. So we actually had in the survey of the GLES a nice item battery on the perceived societary recognition. And you see here the expected effects of people living in a left behind place, perceiving themselves as being less recognized by society than others. So this little bit gives an example of what is so nice about those geocoded survey data, that you can actually also look at the attitudinal level and kind of look into the mechanism at work. And I would expect here that probably this perceived societary recognition actually works as a mediator of the effect of the neighborhood. So concluding here and coming to an end, as I said, geocoded surveys allow to look into this mechanism at work. They give us a lot of flexibility to operationalize place and place characteristics. And still we have a lot of challenges, of course. We need to define relevant neighborhoods and indicators. The availability of geospatial information on small spatial scales is still a problem. We have, of course, self-selection biases, both in surveys as well as to places and neighborhoods. So there's always the risk of endogeneity in this kind of analysis as well. And we have a lot of methodological challenges. Sebastian and Pascal in their first talk talked about the modifiable area unit problem. Spatial autocorrelation is a risk. So there's still a lot of discuss when you use those surveys and try to explain these attitudes and behavior with place-based variables. But still, there's a growing availability and curation of those geocoded survey, and I think give a nice tool of getting more insights and how neighborhood actually affects attitudes and behavior. That's it from my side. I have, I think, 2 more slides. Firstly, the expert contact. So if you want to contact me or our GLES team, you find the email address right here. Also, there's a lot of individual consulting offered by GLES. So you could check out, or you should check out the website if you're interested in something across the research data cycle. And lastly, I also want to point out our upcoming talks, at least for February and March and April. I put down the talks here on the slides. So we'll talk about the Eurobarometer and the Albus cumulation. And as I said, Stefan will talk about the geocoder we use here for our geocoded surveys. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.